There's a lot of debate going on right now within Congress about Washington, D.C. becoming a state. And people that live in Washington, D.C. have been wanting to be a state like forever. And we want to talk about why Washington, D.C. isn't actually a state and why it's rooted in white supremacy. So, they're saying D.C. statehood, they'll say, will accomplish two long-term goals that a lot of people have been fighting for. They said we needed full representation in Congress and a D.C. government that's completely independent from congressional rule. Now, they said that more than 700,000 residents are denied the basic elements of democracy in this country. Now, I say this is the long history of anti-black racism and the fear of black political power. They do not want us to have no kind of freedom or say so or equality in this country, whether at a political level, whether local, governments, whether it's just controlling the area of commerce. They do not want to share equal power of anything. Now, recently I was hearing Republicans, of course, it's always them more than anybody else that's just open with it. But they were saying that, well, DC shouldn't become a state because they don't have car dealerships. I'm like, huh? Another one said DC shouldn't become a state because they don't have an airport. They trying to make up a bunch of things to say, so why Washington, D.C. should not be a state? Well, if it became a state, that means Muriel Bowser would become a governor. They would have their own National Guard. They would have the same rights and privileges as any other state would have. Now, the main reason also on top of that, we're going to get to this. So you're saying that as Congress debates, the fate of D.C. and Jim Crow Joe supports D.C. becoming a state. It said that revisiting the history of the capital's taxation without representation exposes the reality. It said the history clear provides, this reason why DC statehood invites deep scrutiny of arguments made against their freedom there. So they say when the federal government moves to DC back in the 1800s, Congress controlled the capital, but DC residents still had some local autonomy, and elections. They say then after the Civil War, they say Congress passed legislation granting, black Americans, men the right to vote even before the 15th Amendment. They say, and in 1868, DC mayoral election, nearly 50% of the registered voters in DC were black men. They say they were instrumental in electing local leaders who pushed school integration and passed anti-discrimination civil rights laws. Now, say in that period of black suffrage, saying political power was short-lived, however, but in 1874, Congress installed a board of commissioners composed of 3 appointed leaders to run the DC municipal government. Most white Washingtonians supported the plan. It's in part because Congress would pay 50% of DC's budget, and say they were also willing to give up their access to the vote, so black people no longer have political power in DC. They say the Organic Act of 1878, part of the compromise that officially ended Reconstruction, it made the commissioner structure as permanent, and in all DC residents lost the vote for nearly 100 years. Understand, they want to make sure that black people do not have a right to vote, have a right to participate, have a right to do anything. And this is why the Republicans today are fighting against this once again, because of the people that's in Washington, D.C., black people. That's under this system, that Congress exercised immense power over D.C., which allows Southern segregation to enforce their racial policies in the Capitol. It says Senator Theodore Bilbo, for example, he was from Mississippi. He declared that he wanted to be on the Senate committee on the District of Columbia so he could keep Washington a segregated city. Now, he was actually a Democrat in that time period. Said Bilbo and his Southern colleagues were so successful that one 1940s commentator said that the former Confederacy clutched D.C. as a helpless pawn and held it as a capital of white supremacy. This is what they was reporting back in the 1940s. They say, but home rule allowed Washingtonians to elect their leaders and govern themselves, grew more popular as the nation fought fascism in World War II and communism in the Cold War. They also continue to say that many advocates emphasize that lack of democracy in D.C. hurts the U.S. image abroad. It says, so as long as we put up with arbitrary rule of American citizens by persons in whom with selection they have no part of. Okay, they say they warn that they are vulnerable to criticism of being hypocritical. So they were talking about the underlying issues here, right? They were saying that the sentiments are far from universal as a combination of business leaders, whites and Southern members of Congress, as they oppose home rule. Anything that black folks to govern themselves, they did not want. So it said underlying this undemocratic position was an anti-black racism and fear of black political power. It said the number of African Americans in the Capitol doubled from 1910 to 1940, and by 1957, African Americans constituted more than half of the district's population. White support of home rule declined as this percentage grew, because they were starting to say, hey, we need to fight for ourselves here. And then white folks say, hell no, we don't want to be living underneath the control of black folk. So they say, according to those who testified, they say in congressional hearings, it said many white Washingtonians feared that if we get home rule, and I quote, the Negroes would take over the city and that minority groups would control local elections here. They say in response to a Washington Post survey, they said on home rule in 1966, they said that white D.C. residents clearly articulated the racism behind their opposition, saying such things that it isn't right that the nation's capital be all colored. They said they don't have the right education to do the job, and rejecting the idea because, I quote, colored fellows would be mayor and no other reason. Once again, that has always been the sentiment in America. It has not changed. And as long as these people are in power, it won't change. They don't want to be underneath a black person at all. Male, female, does not matter. They don't want that. They feel that they shouldn't have to listen to you. They feel that you're inferior to them. So this is why they don't want you running anything, okay? Then you look at it also as you continue this. They say that congressmen themselves, right, admitted that race objections to home rule was one of the silent objections to the passage. They say in private, not in confidence, they say they are opposed to this bill because they fear it would give, and I quote, the Negro domination over the District of Columbia. So the white supremacists can be dominating everything, but just one little area they fear that black folk, will be in control, because they don't want you to have no control at all. And at the time period, they said another man testified that a member of Congress was reputed to have said that he would never vote for suffrage for the people of the District of Columbia as long as there were one Negro living in the district who would qualify as a voter. And understand all these voter suppression efforts that you see. And I'm a firm believer of this. Voting, it should be a right. It's your right to vote. It's your right not to vote. And you should not be scrutinized one way or another. But no one should take away your right to vote. Voting suppression is rooted into anti-black racism. You better understand that. That's all come from Jim Crow. You see Georgia, what's going on over there right now, trying to suppress the vote. And this is why people talking about boycott companies in Georgia that was a part of that. I just read Texas in the Senate just passed a bill about mail-in ballots. Anything they can do to stop black people from voting or to limit the votes of black people, this is what they're going to do, because it is rooted in Jim Crow. Understand, voting suppression is rooted in Jim Crow. No matter what they say, it's rooted in Jim Crow. So you can't vote and they can cheat, in everything they like to do. Okay. They were the ones that came up with a poll tax. They was the ones that came up with, okay, in order for you to group vote, how many marbles in this jar? Anything they could do to stop black people from voting. So they were saying that after decades of activism and organizing by Washingtonians and the Voting Rights Act, which, increased black voting rights in the South, it said D.C. gained a non-voting delegate in the House in 1971 and home rule in 1973, yet the government structure still granted Congress considerable power over the district's affairs. So although activists have pushed, as if for statehood before the 1970s, they more joined in the cause as they continue to usurp D.C.'s autonomy after the home rule passage. Okay, so they have somebody, but they'll have no right to vote on any bills. Isn't that stupid? That's completely stupid. But all of this to prevent black people from having anywhere they're more dominant at. You understand? This wouldn't have been an issue at all if this was a all-white area. So understand, voter suppression, once again, is rooted in anti-black racism. The fight against DC statehood is rooted by American history into anti-black racism. So anything that's rooted in anti-black racism, you should be completely against that. You know, you should support statehood for Washington D.C. You should support that. You should be against any kind of voter suppression efforts. Whether you want to vote or not, you should always be against that. Because if you sit there and let them take away your right to vote as black people, then what's next? You always got to remember that. When people take things away from you, you usually don't get it back. You usually don't. So never let people take freedoms away from you. Never allow that, because that's completely wrong, to take away any kind of freedom from a person. And understand, black people fought and died for this. So this is why I really do support them passing that For the People Act. I actually support them doing that, because it will shut down all these things that's going on with this voter suppression efforts. Also, the real important part out of that For the People Act, if you read it, is the independent councils that they will come up with to do the districts. Because as it is right now, is a lot of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is basically whatever political party is in charge, they can cheat for themselves. And you know the Republicans is going to do all the funny style business to make sure that black people don't have no way to vote, splitting districts up based on population and who's over there so they can stay in power. So they wouldn't even, the state people couldn't do it no more. What they would do once that becomes federal law is have an independent council do the districts, which I believe is more fair. Because especially in places like here in Texas, you know, you have Republican rule and they do all the districts, and you know the districts is not going to be in any kind of favor of black people or any other people that's non-white. You know this. So I think that For the People Act, it should be something that should be passed, because most of this stuff to stop us from voting and stop DC statehood, understand it's all rooted in anti-black racism and white supremacy. So we do need to definitely point that out and speak up on that. You know, some of you, you know, you say we built the country, and that's great, and we have, and that's definitely the truth. Well, if you're going to say all that, then you can't let the rights for people that died go away, because these people every day, these people don't sleep. See, the thing is, y'all don't understand. You get one victory and you want to go celebrate and sit down. You don't understand that when you get a one victory, they planning the next attack. That's why you can't take a day off. Y'all have to understand that. That's why I kind of have the motto of I don't take days off. I mean, yeah, I may have a day off per se, but I don't have a day off, because if your enemies is working 24/7, you need to work 24/7, or have an infrastructure in place where you stay working 24/7 even though you're taking a day off. You understand what I'm saying? And that's what we're establishing and building here, is that infrastructure where we always running 24/7 and we can always stay on top of things. But let me know, you know, in the comments, you know, about this, about the DC statehood and all the different voter suppression efforts. Trust me, they could take away that gerrymandering away from them. Oh boy, they're going to lose their mind. Trust me, they really going to lose their mind about the gerrymandering, because they depend on that to have an advantage in Congress and the Senate.